Hi, good afternoon and good evening, especially to our speakers, Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis, as well as our audiences joining over Zoom, as well as through Yale Center Beijing's WeChat video channel. Welcome to this Yale Center Beijing and Yale University Press Find Your Next Great Read series event featuring the 2021 Lionel Gilbert Book Prize winner, Trade Wars or Class Wars. And thanks to the Yale University Press and Yale Center Beijing's program director, Devin Lau, we're delighted to be able to invite both authors to speak about this important book. I'm Carol Lee Rafferty, Executive Director of the Center and a Yale College alumna. Before I introduce our distinguished guests and talk about the rundown of this event, I'd like to give a quick introduction about what Yale Center Beijing is. Yale Center Beijing is Yale University's only university-wide center outside of the US. Founded in 2014, the Yale Center Beijing hosts programming like this almost every other day, where we convene leaders from academia, business, government, and other sectors for thought-provoking conversations on the most important issues facing our world. For today's event, our distinguished speakers, Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis, will present on their important new book, Trade Wars are Class Wars. Now, this is what the jury of the 2021 Lionel Gilbert Book Prize said about this book. The book tells the gripping story of how economic policies have generated inequality both within and between states and created global tensions and political polarization. The book combines political and economic analysis with short history to argue that domestic policies that advantage the rich at the expense of workers produce not only strife at home, but also deepen international rivalries. This book speaks powerfully and directly to one of the biggest challenges of our times. I was grateful to be able to speak with both authors, and this book was written before COVID and now the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So it'd be very interesting to hear them kind of comment on this new context as well. Matthew Klein is the economics commentator at Barron's and a Yale College alumnus. He has been called one of the most astute commentators on the global economy. He's read across the world by central bankers, chief economists, academics, policymakers, and investors. And Klein has given background presentations to staffers of the UK Parliament, White House economic advisors, and officials at the European Commission. He has over a decade of experience studying the intersection of economics, public policy, and financial markets, and has written for The Economist, Bloomberg, the Financial Times, and Barron's. He now runs The Overshoot, which is a premium subscription research service dedicated to tracking the global economy. Michael Pettis is a professor at Peking University's Guanghua School of Management, where he specializes in Chinese financial markets. He has been in China for the past 20 years. Before moving to China in 2002, he has worked on Wall Street in trading and capital markets and corporate finance since 1987. From 1992 to 2001, he also taught finance at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business. He has published over 200 articles in various leading periodicals, along with 6 books, the most recent of which is the book we're talking about today. He received an MBA in finance and an MIN in development economics from Columbia University, and he's also a senior fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua China Center. After the authors speak about their book, my colleague Joyce Wang, who is Deputy Director of the Yale Center Beijing, will moderate the Q&A afterward. Throughout the talk, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and our team will take note and unmute you to ask your questions in turn once we start our Q&A. Without further ado, let's welcome Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. So Michael said I should go first, so we're just going to give kind of a basic outline of the narrative. Carol already kind of laid out the very high-level summary, but our general point when we were starting to think through this at the end of 2017 was that a lot of people look at economic conflicts as being between countries, and that governments are essentially looking out for the best interests of everyone in a country, and that they're competing national interests or incompatible cultures. And that's why we have things like the US-China trade conflict, or why during the Euro crisis you had the Germans versus the Greeks. Our point of view is that this was completely the wrong way of looking at this. That looking at it as a country as being a unified entity is not really going to give you a good understanding of how the economy or financial system works. That it's much more helpful to look at what's going on inside different societies, and how people often across societies at the same level of the social strata have much more common interests than they do necessarily with other people in their own society. And so being very concrete about this, when people look at the US-China conflict, it's not that Chinese workers are taking advantage of American workers or anything like that. It's that changes within the Chinese political economy of the past 30 years disadvantaged certain groups of people within China, many large portions of the Chinese population, at the expense of others. And that is a side effect of this that also harmed American workers while enriching other people in the United States and in other countries as well. And so these are the looking at this kind of level analysis is really what we wanted to do and explain in the course of the book. And we look at it, we focus really on we lay out sort of the theoretical argument for how this works in general. We do some broader historical things going back a couple hundred years, but then we really focus in detail on Germany, Germany, and then Europe as a whole, China, and the United States, because these are sort of the most representative. They're the largest economies in the world today, and also the most representative of what's going on, understand what's going on in the world today. And the point that we make is not actually a new one. One of the points we make very on is that this argument was made over 100 years ago, is that when you have too much of a share of income in society going to people at the very, very top of the income distribution, people who don't spend that money on goods and services because they literally can't. They have already bought, they already are able to buy everything they could possibly want, and then there's left over that they just try to save. That ends up creating all sorts of distortions elsewhere in the world that tends to lead to, at the time, over 100 years ago, the argument was it led to imperialism and the development of colonies to essentially forcibly receive the excess production. And then, in the more modern period, it doesn't lead to that necessarily, but it does lead to, very large trade imbalances, very large debt bubbles, and then all the tensions and social political polarization that comes from that. And that's really the point of what we were trying to explain in the book. And as you mentioned, we wrote this. We put the finishing touches on the manuscript, I think, in the beginning of January 2020. Obviously, a lot of things have happened since then, but as sort of a model of understanding how the different pieces of the global economy fit together, it did end up, providing some insight into why, certain economic outcomes, since COVID began, are the way they are. Why, for example, was it that China's trade surplus blew out the way it did when previously it looked like it had been shrinking? When the U.S. trade deficit kind of went the opposite direction in response to COVID, there were very different responses that the governments there had, that those reflect sort of the underlying political economy. They fit with the model that we have in the book, and that's really the story we tell, and how it applies across countries and across time. So hopefully that gives you a good layout. I don't know if Michael wants to jump in and add more specifics here, or how much we want to focus on Q&A, but that's basically sort of the outline of the main argument and how we think about these questions.
Let me extend one of the things that Matt discussed, and that's this issue of savings. I think there were 2 points in our book that surprised quite a lot of people. One of the points is that savings is really not a cultural trait. We look at high savings countries like Germany or China or Japan or South Korea, and we say, well, there's something in the air, something in the water that makes them save a lot. And then we look at low savings countries like the US or England, and we say, well, again, there's some cultural reason why these people don't like to save. And what we show is that that's pretty much nonsense. Matt mentioned that rich people don't consume their income. And when you think about the distribution of income in a country, there are basically, you can think about 4 sectors. You can think about rich people, ordinary people, businesses, and governments. And out of all of those groups, only ordinary people consume most of their income. The other groups consume zero or a very low share of their income. So when you look at high savings countries, the first thing you notice is distortions in the way income is distributed. Less of the money goes to ordinary people, and more of it goes either to the rich or to businesses or to governments. And as a result, the savings rate automatically goes up, not because people become culturally thrifty or anything like that. It's just a shift of income. If you want to increase the savings rate in your country, it's quite easy. Take money away from workers and give it to somebody else. The second point that I think really surprised a lot of people, and you see that still in the debate, a real misunderstanding about the sources of the American imbalances, is our argument that Americans don't control their savings rates. Because the US has completely open capital markets, money traditionally has come into the US. There was a period of time from, say, World War I until the 1960s, where the US was a net exporter of capital, but for much of its history, it's been a net importer, and often in ways that are beyond its control. With completely open capital account, if foreigners want to put money in the US, they can do so without any restrictions. And that's very important, because one of the things that we point out is that net inflows in any country, this is not just the US, cause an increase in the gap between investment up here and savings down here. And so when money comes into the country, either it forces investment up, which was the story in the 19th century, or it forces savings down, which has been pretty much the story since the 1970s. And I think that's a really important point, because when people say the US runs a current account deficit because it saves too little, and if only we could get Americans to save more, the current account deficit would disappear, we argue, no, that's backwards. Americans save too little because it runs a current account deficit. And it runs a current account deficit because it runs a capital account surplus. Because foreigners, when they have excess savings, automatically put it in the US financial markets, which are the deepest, the best governed, the most flexible, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that shocked a lot of people when we argued that we can't control our savings rate if we don't control our capital account. And I think that's something that right now the Congress is discussing. I've been told, and I know Mike Stumo sent an email to you, Matt, about a new bill they're hoping to submit, which tries precisely to address that problem. But anyway, let me stop there and open it up to questions.
Thank you so much for the introduction for your book. Actually, we collect some questions during the registration. So maybe I can start to ask a few questions to warm up this session. And then, if the participants have any question, you can either type your question in the chat room, or maybe you can just raise your hands. I will unmute you to ask your question directly. Actually, there's a lot of different kind of questions. I just group some of the questions. Maybe I can ask both of you. The first question maybe started, and the people asked why you choose this perspective. There's many aspects to the impact of the trade war. Why you choose this perspective, and what kind of class war do you think a trade war is against the upper class or the whole society?
Do you want to address that, Matt, or should we just take turns?
Sure. Yes, I mean, I think the reason we picked this perspective is because it's something that I think is the most useful for understanding just all of the different dynamics at play. And it's also something that I think it's complex enough that it really does require a book to really explain all the mechanics. And I mean, I know, I've been reading Michael's work for years, and it took me a while for me to wrap my head around, this way of thinking about things. It makes a lot of sense once you get your head around it, but it does take a while, I think, to sort of digest and internalize it. And so, having a book length treatment that's, actually lays out the argument, I think we felt was very important. And because we really were not seeing these kinds of points being made in the public discussion at the time. And even now, I mean, there are people who will say this, but it's still not necessarily the thing that everyone has accepted as being the right way of looking at it. In terms of what the class war is, I guess one way of looking at this, I think, is very helpful and ties on what Michael was saying, is that because you have a situation where a lot of people globally are being given less income than they are affected, than the value of what it is they're producing, that ends up creating a sort of perpetual imbalance between the total amount of goods and services that are available to be produced and then how much actual buying of those goods and services is occurring. And that creates a problem because if you're an individual business, it means that you basically are having to fight for market share with not necessarily a lot of growth in terms of the overall market. And that leads to, that's sort of why you have companies and countries, trying to say like, oh, we're gonna use tariffs to protect our businesses or what have you. But it's also a problem because it means that globally, it gives people the sense that prosperity for, one set of people is coming at the expense of other people. It makes the world more zero sum than it actually is. And that is, I think, the subtitle of the book was How Rising Inequality Distorts the Global Economy and Threatens International Peace. And, we were not predicting that, we'd immediately have some world war or anything like that. But it is, I think, reasonable to say that you have this persistent period of weak economic growth and lots of tensions between peoples in different countries who think that they're losing out because of people in other countries, rightly or wrongly, mostly wrongly, then that undermines the fabric of global order. It's the same thing that Keynes was worried about when he wrote the general theory in 1936. And so that's the framing that we were thinking of and why it was important. We wrote this book in mostly in 2018, 2019, and that was something that was very much on our minds. And at the time, a lot of people were focused on the US-China dynamic. We also focused on internal Europe because it wasn't the kind of thing where people were worried about a shooting war in the same way or anything like that. But there was sort of a real concern about the breakdown of the European project, and that was that has not come to pass. In fact, now we're seeing kind of the opposite, things going the opposite direction. But it was something, these are the kinds of things that we were worried about in terms of undermining political stability, even internally in the United States. These were kind of big issues that were coming up, and so that's what motivated us to write the book the way we did.
Thank you. So, Professor Pettis, do you want to add anything or?
If there are a lot of questions, maybe we should go through them. Otherwise, Matt and I can spend 2 hours on just one question.
Okay. Okay.
That's always a risk.
Yeah, you just mentioned when you write this book, you saw the issues in the U.S. society. So this question also asked, will the majority of the U.S. society realize this fact? Is there a way that the trade war could effectively mitigate class conflict in the U.S.?
Well, I think, I'm happy to say that there's a growing awareness of the arguments that Matt and I are making. 10 years ago, I think people would have just thought they were ridiculous. And I think there's an increasing awareness that there's a real fundamental problem in the way the global trade and capital flow regime work. And when you consider, we've been having trade conflicts basically since the world opened up in the 1970s. We went to floating rate currencies and the removal of all capital controls in the United States. By 1983, all capital controls have been removed. And ever since then, we've seen these huge imbalances and enormous attempts to address these imbalances, including the really misguided Trump tariffs, which in our book we explain couldn't possibly work because they're solving the wrong problem. And the way I think about the wrong problem is, and again, Matt mentioned Keynes, and Keynes spoke about this very specifically in sort of the Bretton Woods negotiations. He argued, look, if you have big imbalances, that means some countries have surpluses and some countries have deficits. There's two ways you can resolve those imbalances. You can force the deficit countries to resolve them by contracting demand. And he said that's a terrible solution because what it means is that global demand, the only way to solve imbalances is to reduce global demand, which means, of course, slowing down growth, raising unemployment, and all those other things. And he said the right thing to do is to force the surplus countries to resolve them by expanding domestic demand. And we're sort of taking off on that point. One of the points that we make is that if you look at the countries that run persistent surpluses, There's a lot of cliches about these countries. One cliche, which I hope we've undermined, is that these countries are culturally attuned towards thrift. No, that's not true at all. The second cliche is that these countries are really good at manufacturing. That's why they run surpluses. That's not true at all. The reward for being good at manufacturing is that you get to import more and more stuff for less and less of what you produce. The reward is improving terms of trade. The reward of being good at manufacturing is not a surplus. So why do countries have surpluses? Well, if you look around, it's very clear when you see the data. I think that's why our argument had such a big impact, even though almost everybody failed to understand it in the beginning. It's just because the data are so clear. If you look at Germany, if you look at China, if you look at Japan, if you look at any of the surplus countries, what you notice is that in every one of them, workers make less relative to their productivity than they do for their trading partners. So some people say, what are you talking about? Germans have high wages. Yes, Germans have high wages, but they have much higher productivity. So German productivity is about 15 to 20% higher than British productivity, but wages are roughly the same. And that's what we mean. We mean that in order to be competitive in trade, everybody knows the same trick. You must lower your wages, either directly, the way perhaps the Germans did in 2003, 2004, or indirectly by weakening your currency, by environmental degradation, which is a way of lowering wages, by undermining the social safety network, which is another way of lowering wages. But if you do that, you do two things. First of all, you reduce global demand, so your doing that is bad for the world economy. But you increase your share of global demand, so you actually benefit. So the point we make is that we're locked in a world not in which evil business owners are conspiring to lower wages. We're locked in a world in which the only way you can gain international competitiveness is by directly or indirectly lowering wages. And whoever does it the most wins. And this is a Keynesian nightmare because we've locked ourselves into a regime in which countries individually benefit by hurting the global economy. And so what we're arguing is that we need to get out of that regime. And that may mean a contraction in international trade. It will certainly mean a contraction in global capital flows. But the consequence of not doing it, we already know what that is. We've seen this for 50 years. As the world grows, not very quickly, it's growing slowly, but the income of the bottom half isn't moving at all. If you go to all of the major economies, the advanced economies, in the US, for example, the bottom half make as much money today as they did in the 1980s, even though the US economy is much bigger. And in order to generate growth, because consumption isn't generating growth, consumption based on income, then the only way to generate growth is through consumption based on rising household debt. So we argue we're locked in a world that explains much of what we've been seeing in the last 4 or 5 decades. Growth has slowed. The growth in wages of the bottom half has slowed even more, and household debt has exploded. And this isn't a coincidence. This is the un-Keynesian world we've locked ourselves in.
Thank you so much. This one question from Tianyi Sun. Her question is, you mentioned that the trade war is class war. What kind of a hierarchy is the main reason to cause the trade war, and why?
I think this gets back to somewhat what Michael was saying, which is the sense that if you have a shrinking global pie, and the only way to grow over an individual business is to essentially increase your market share in a shrinking pie, that is going to, one of the things that you might try to do as a business to maintain, to do that is to sort of shut out competitors from abroad and appeal to nationalist, rhetoric in order to do that. And so that's sort of, I think, part of the linkage there, that, the root issue is the internal class dynamics that are occurring in a bunch of societies, often independent. There is certainly some sort of global connection, which, as Michael was saying, if every business in order to survive has to, there's this downward pressure on wages, but at the same time, there are also sort of specific idiosyncratic stories for each society for why these things happen the way they do. That's why we spend so much time talking about what exactly happened in China over the past 30 years, what exactly happened in Germany and Europe over the past 30 plus years. And those forces end up pushing, transferring income either through lower wages to higher profits, or shift in the wage distribution, or things like switching income from workers to, say, local governments, things like that. And all those things, what they end up doing is because they're reducing total demand for all the things that businesses produce, but not actually affecting how much businesses produce, that creates sort of problem. So, the businesses need to find, they have a hard time selling the stuff that they're still able to produce. And so then someone has to be, either they just produce less, and that creates, sort of global depression, or at least, much weaker economy than otherwise would be, or someone else has to be borrowing a lot to make up the difference. And so, for example, before 2008, you saw that with, US households, and you saw it in Europe with, in the crisis countries, governments and households there borrowed a ton. Then that broke down, and we had a massive financial crisis and very weak growth globally, and then we sort of were stuck for 10 years or so after that, basically until 2020, and this sort of weak growth, bad, unsustainable and yet long, period of sort of weak economy under utilizing excess capacity. Not excess capacity in the sense that all material needs have been fully met, but excess capacity in the sense that there wasn't enough money available to people who wanted to buy things to actually buy the things that all the world's businesses were capable of producing, and that just created this imbalance. So in that sense, the class war, which is sort of the fundamental cause of all that, was the driver of then all the trade conflicts and economic conflicts that show up between countries. And you have Germans and Dutch going after Greeks and Spaniards, or Americans and Chinese, and that those things are really sort of the secondary consequence of the internal drivers, in each of these countries, and which we explain those mechanics in the book.
Okay, thank you. There's also participant asking about the trade wars, how related with the geopolitical issues. There's a question about how do you interpret the Russian-Ukraine conflict in the context of the trade or class war? What kind of economic implications does the conflict have on the rest of the world, besides the more intermediate oil price and commodity price cycles?
Well, I think you have to be careful. This argument isn't an explanation for every conflict, except in a general sense. Mm-hmm. If you agree with our basic argument, then you will agree that there is a reason why we've seen stagnation in wages in most of the developed countries, and in developing countries like Russia. There's been a stagnation in wages. There are huge imbalances in trade, and these imbalances have been very difficult for some countries to swallow. For other countries, they've been a way of resolving domestic problems that they don't want to resolve. And one of the consequences, and this is not the first time it's happened in previous globalization cycles. One of the consequences as these imbalances grow is that you get more and more anger at the system, you get more and more nationalism, more and more populism. So to that extent, if you want to fit the Russian-Ukrainian thing within this context, perhaps you could argue that the populism that we're seeing in both countries and elsewhere is a reflection of these deep imbalances. But I don't want to overly simplify. The fact is there are many reasons for the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and these date back all the way back to the 1980s, if you like, or the 1990s. There's lots of reasons for it. But our basic argument is really an economic argument, which might then lead to political problems. And it's a very serious economic problem. And that is that we have a global trading regime in which businesses and countries are not rewarded for improving productivity. They are rewarded for reducing wages. either way makes you more competitive. And we would like to be in a world where you become more competitive by raising workers' productivity, but we're not in that world. We're in the world where you become more competitive by lowering workers' wages. And we say that that's just unsustainable. Even if you like that system, it's unsustainable. We have to come up with a different system.
Okay, thank you. There's David also asked questions.
All right. It's a bit of a broad one. I apologize for him, but would the global trade war sanction also be affecting the current younger global generation, affecting their difficulty to rise to the same financial success that previous generations found ease in? Again, for example, the recent and previous stock market crashes and the current property rent rise with wage stagnation.
I think that's definitely plausible. I think that there is definitely an element of luck of when you are born and when you start earning, in terms of what asset prices are like and how that affects your life trajectory. If you were in a situation where you get to buy financial assets starting in the early 1980s, when in the US your P ratios are under 10 and bond yields were over 10%, I mean, that's just a very different kind of environment than when P ratios are 30 and bond yields are 2. In terms of your expected returns. So in that sense, yes. But although I don't know how much of that's, trade wars, class wars dynamic versus, there just tends to be sort of long cycles of things being, that's just how life is, and it's not really fair. I mean, people born in terms of when the Great Depression was before or after, that affects their life trajectory tremendously as well. But I think that's definitely the case. It's certain when you are born and what the circumstances are can definitely have long-term effects on your, what your well-being is like. I also like to add, if you don't mind, on the Russia-Ukraine issue, we certainly didn't write anything to explain that, but I do think it's interesting if you look at Russia's internal dynamics. This was a society. One thing we did talk about, I think, relates to this was a society that is very unequal, was very unequal, and in addition also had a severe financial crisis in the late 1990s, along with a bunch of countries in East Asia and the Asian financial crisis, and responded in a similar way, which was initially in the 1990s, the government had been, supporting borrowing to invest in modernizing the economy. After that, having a very different financial posture to prevent that, focusing on very tight government budgets and accumulating foreign reserves and underinvesting in, physical infrastructure to the same extent that it was before, which, seems to be, in retrospect, that that may not have been the most useful strategy for them, but that, you can see that playing out in terms of their balance of payments dynamics and how that related to the rest of the world, and that sort of the fact that they so much of the income and wealth that was generated from Russian natural resources ended up not being reinvested into domestic technological productive capacity is something that they're probably regretting right now.
Okay, next question. So some people asked, actually several questions asked how the ordinary people prepared for the consequences, impact brought by the trade war.
It depends what you mean by the trade war. We would argue that a correct resolution of these trade imbalances would hurt certain groups and benefit certain groups. It wouldn't hurt countries and benefit countries, but it would benefit workers, it would benefit farmers, it would benefit producers. And it would hurt probably financiers and those with movable capital. So we think actually a rebalancing of global trade would be very good for the groups that have really paid for these big imbalances. One thing that may be a good illustration of the way we think about this, we didn't really talk very much about this in our book, but since then, it's become a really big topic. And that's, the whole issue of countries running into debt problems and sovereign defaults. Yesterday, Sri Lanka announced that it was going to have real trouble paying its debt. We know that several countries in Africa, in Latin America, and the one that's occupying the most space right now is Argentina. And many people see these conflicts over whether or not they're going to pay and how much they're going to pay as a conflict between countries again. So if you look at the argument in Argentina, it's sort of on one side are the American and European creditors, or on the other side is the Argentine government. And either Argentina will win or the Americans and Europeans will win. And what we would argue, using this trade framework, is that's completely the wrong way to look at it. Because Argentina generates export earnings, right? They export stuff and they make money. And we need to focus on how those earnings are recycled. It's an accounting identity that every dollar that enters Argentina, and this is true of every country, every dollar that enters through the capital or the current account must leave through the capital or current account. So Argentina is not getting money through the capital account. No one will lend it money, but it is earning money through exports. So what does it do with those dollars? Well, it can do two things, broadly speaking. It can import stuff, or it can repay the creditors. And so what our framework would argue is that rather than look at the sovereign debt negotiation, and I'm writing a paper now that with the title, Sovereign Debt Restructurings Are Trade Issues, our framework would say that if Argentina takes that dollar and uses it to repay debt, then they're increasing the savings of the world, because the debt will go to an investor, typically a wealthy investor, and savings will go up. And the world doesn't need savings, it's got too much. If the Argentines use that to import something, then they would have to buy, something from an American farmer or from an American manufacturer, or European for that matter, and they would add to global demand. So our framework says that a debt restructuring is not a conflict between the debtor nation and the creditors. It's a conflict between wealthy investors in both the debtor nation and the creditor nation. So both rich Argentines and Americans and Europeans benefit from debt repayment. And the ones who lose out are not just Argentine farmers and workers, but American farmers and workers and European farmers and workers, because they're forced into a world in which Argentine imports, which is their demand, is converted into Argentine debt payments, which doesn't add to global demand. So what we argue is that you really need to think of all of these imbalances as really income imbalances, not national imbalances. Mm-hmm. And you can use this framework to understand a lot of sometimes fairly complicated things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's several questions about the China-US trade war, and ask about how it's developed, and how will you view the China-US relation in the next 5-10 years, and what China would to do to penetrate this power.
Do you want me to deal with China, Matt, and then you can answer the same question from the European context, because it's a very similar question.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Should we do that?
Sure.
First of all, I'm quite pessimistic. I think things are going to get worse before they get better. And I've been saying this since 2010, so maybe I'm locked into this cycle. But I don't see things getting better immediately. The problem is that the US attempt to address these trade imbalances was based on really an obsolete theory of trade. Why does China run a surplus? Well, by definition, Chinese savings are higher than Chinese investment. Now that's sort of weird, because China has the highest investment rate of any country in history. In fact, it's a huge problem. China way overinvests, debt is soaring, and everyone knows that they've got to do something about it. It's got an incredibly high investment rate. Normally, countries with high investment rates run deficits, trade deficits, because the deficit, or the current account deficit, is the gap between savings and investment. In China, in spite of having an incredibly high investment rate, you have an even higher savings rate. Again, the highest in history. We've never seen a savings rate this high. So why do the Chinese save so much? Well, it's not Chinese people who save that much. Mm-hmm. Chinese people save more or less in line with other developing countries at similar income levels and similar social safety levels. So they save like prudent, normal people save. But the reason the savings rate in China is so high, which is the same thing as saying the reason the consumption rate in China is so low, is because household income in China is the lowest as a share of GDP of any country in history, right? There are a couple of small temporary exceptions. Arab oil sheikdoms, when oil prices are very high, will sometimes be for 6 months or a year worse than China. But basically, for 20 years, China has had the lowest household income share by far in history. In other words, when an average American produces on average $100 worth of goods, his pay is roughly $80. In Europe, his pay will be between $70 to $80. In developing countries that have very low relative pay, they might get $65. In China, the average worker gets paid $55 for producing $100 worth of goods. So as a result, it's not surprising that he or she cannot consume a very large share of what is produced. They consume a very low share. And remember, savings, the economic definition of savings, is just whatever you produce minus whatever you consume, that's what you save. So the Chinese cannot consume most of what they get because they get paid such a low share of what they produce. So how do you solve the problem? Tariffs don't work because tariffs don't change the savings imbalance in China. The only way to solve the savings imbalance in China is to significantly increase the household share of GDP. Well, that's easy to say, but as we point out in the book, you can't increase somebody's share without reducing somebody else's share. And this has always been the problem. I won't go through all the details, but the share that has to be reduced is the share primarily of local governments. You need a massive transfer of income from local governments to ordinary households. But how do you do that without significant political disruption, significant institutional reform? Well, we've known, Albert Hirschman wrote about this in the 1960s and 70s. We know that it's incredibly difficult to do that. So the only way to resolve China's domestic imbalances is domestically. It's by shifting income from the government to the household sector. The only thing the US can do if it wants to stop absorbing this huge demand deficiency, tariffs won't work. Because as long as China has this imbalance, it has to run a surplus. And as long as it runs a surplus, it has to export savings. And as long as those savings go directly or indirectly to the US must run the corresponding deficit. It might run it with China, it might not. One of the things we point out in our book is never look at bilateral trade imbalances. They tell you nothing. So we argued from the very beginning, Trump's tariffs couldn't possibly work. They might reduce the American deficit with China, but if they did, they would automatically increase the American deficit with the rest of the world. And as you can see from the data, that's exactly what happened. So the only way the US can protect itself is by refusing to accept the excess savings of countries that have these domestic demand imbalances. And that really means interfering with the capital account. And that's something I think eventually we're going to do. But if we were to do it tomorrow, it would create a crisis. Why? Because if China cannot export its excess savings, it cannot have excess savings. And that means, by definition, the gap between investment and savings collapses to zero. Now, we saw what that does in 2009. China's current account surplus went from 10% to 3% in 2 years because of the global crisis. And that created a real crisis within China. They had to close the gap. I won't go through all the details because it's quite long and we explain it in the book. But the way you reduce savings is by increasing debt or increasing unemployment, which they didn't want to do. And the way you increase investment is by spending tons on investment, which they didn't want to do. They were already over investing. So when China's current account gap closed very rapidly. Many people argue that that was the beginning, 2009, 2010, that was the serious beginning of the problems with China's development model, which we're still struggling to deal with today. So that shows you how difficult it is to resolve these imbalances. And the old-fashioned way of imposing tariffs, they do nothing because the imbalances are savings imbalances. Maybe you can tell the German and Europe story, Matt.
Yeah, I mean,
because it's
just
a
getting to the
huge
original,
story.
framing of the question, it's not so much that, the trade war is going to start or anything. I mean, if we're looking at it, not so much on tariffs, but just the impact of trade and how trade has transmitted economic problems, I think it's more accurate to say that there's been a trade conflict for a long period of time. And, whether we've, perceived it or not is a different story, but it's been there. That's really been sort of the key issue. In looking at sort of the European context, what you had there, we write about this in detail in the books. This is going to be the sort of the shorter version, but basically until about 2008, you had within Europe as a whole, production and consumption and investment were all roughly in balance. And so Europe, in terms of how, if you draw a line around Europe, how that interacted with the rest of the world, it wasn't really contributing either way to global imbalances. But inside Europe, there were huge imbalances. And basically what you had was that Germany and the Netherlands were essentially playing the role of China within Europe, where you just had vast amounts of extra production relative to domestic spending. And that was mainly because just domestic spending was very weak, that in Germany, which is much bigger than the Netherlands, it was not doing well during this period. But you had a lot of German companies where they mostly sold abroad. So it didn't matter that, the workers in Germany weren't getting raises and not spending money. It didn't matter that they didn't have customers of other German businesses because German business investment tanked after 2000. It didn't matter that, German government was raising taxes and cutting welfare benefits and making it harder for people to spend money because their customers weren't in Germany. And so the flip side of this was that you had people in Spain and in Ireland and in Greece and in Portugal and in Italy, and they were in the Baltics, and they were spending much more than they were earning. And in some of those countries, it seemed like that was fine because these were rapidly growing economies. They were converging. We don't think about it now, but Spain and Greece and they were essentially the original sort of emerging market success stories. That they weren't. Now we think of them as being advanced. Well, maybe not Greece, but we think of them as sort of being advanced economies. But they weren't. I mean, back in the 70s, these were still military dictatorships. They were barely in sort of what we think of as the Western world, and yet they were converging, and in the 1990s in particular, they're growing very rapidly. And so it made sense at one level. Yeah, of course, you have a rapid growth, a lot of borrowing and investment, and some of this stuff was valuable. Spain, Michael probably actually tell you this better than I, because he has family connections there. But I mean, they built out a tremendous high-speed rail network in Spain. It's very, very good. And in Greece, they built out all sorts of really good infrastructure during this period. The Athens subway system is phenomenal. But there was also there was excess that there's only at any given point in time, whatever society it is, there's only so many worthwhile projects that are it makes sense to do. And if there's more financing available than the right number of projects, and then you're going to do more projects than makes sense, and you end up with you get all the good stuff done, but then you get also these other things. I mean, I think one of the probably most aptly named one was in Spain, the Don Quixote Airport, international airport that was built in La Mancha, which is not near anything. It's about 2 hours drive from Madrid, I think. It's not near anything else. They built it, billions of euros. They had no flights coming in. I think they ended up having to repurpose it for cargo, or I don't know. They sold it. I ended up selling it to someone else for like €1 and then assumed debt because it was just total loss. That's what happened there. You had to have, so the financial crisis hit. So all this borrowing and spending, everything's going well at the time till about 2008. Then you had the financial crisis. And then the question is how you're going to adjust. So in China, we had one method of adjustment, which is the trade and current account surplus compressed pretty dramatically and domestic investment rose. That is the opposite of what happened in Europe. What happened in Europe was that all the countries that had been, spending more than they were earning, that were essentially offsetting the imbalances within Germany from the perspective of the rest of the world, they were forced to cut their spending dramatically because all that all their ability to borrow and spend, turned off. And that was a choice that was made essentially by elites across Europe, both in those countries and in Germany and elsewhere. It was a choice that, just as we were talking about with Argentina, and I mean, they could have made a different choice. The prioritizing creditors and debt repayment over, workers and producers and consumers was something that was they didn't have to make that choice. They did make that choice. It was a choice that was bad for people across Europe, and in fact, across the world as a whole. But it was good for certain people within Europe, which is why they ended up making the choice they did. That ended up then leading to essentially the whole continent of Europe becoming a mega Germany in terms of its impact, both in terms of its domestic dynamics and in terms of the impact on the rest of the world. And Europe ended up having, basically getting to the eve of the pandemic anyway, the largest trade surplus in absolute terms relative to the rest of the world of any society ever, actually bigger relative to the rest of the world than China did on the eve of the global financial crisis, when at that point it was, the biggest of any trade surplus relative to the world as a whole of any country ever. And it was purely driven not by the fact that there was some great export boom out of Europe. There wasn't some miracle of productivity growth. It was just the fact that a lot of people were suddenly cut off from the ability to spend, and then they spent less. And you basically had massive degradation of public infrastructure, massive degradation of living standards, increase in poverty. It was bad for them fundamentally, but it was also bad for everyone else, because everyone who used to make money selling to Europeans, their market share, the size of that market just shrank. And so this is an example of a lose-lose outcome for the vast majority of the world. And that was leading to, among other things, trade, not just conflicts internally within Europe and a lot of understandably heated rhetoric, although misplaced, but also between Europe and others, because other countries were then getting understandably annoyed that they were losing out on their market. I mean, the U.S.-European economic relationship over the past 10 years, or at least leading up into COVID, was not good for this reason, in the sense a lot of the, in fact, commentary of American economic officials and dealing with Europeans, it was similar to what they were, what they'd been saying to, their Chinese counterparts of, why are you not spending more money at home? Why are you making it so that, we're the ones carrying, the global growth to the extent that, that we were. And that was undermining, those kinds of relations as well. And that's, unlike in China, where I think, we saw how the reaction to COVID, I think, kind of was consistent with the sort of pre-pandemic, political economy model. I think actually in Europe, I'm more optimistic than Michael is about China. I wouldn't necessarily have been, but seeing what we've seen over the past couple of years with the way that the Europeans responded to COVID with an unprecedented level of solidarity in terms of how the different governments reacted together, irrespective of which countries were getting hit hardest by the pandemic and how they're going to spend money. And then also, quite frankly, over the past few weeks, in terms of how European governments have reacted in terms of deciding that they're going to support each other, both in terms of things like managing refugee flow and national defense and other things. And so I'm actually more optimistic now than I was a couple of years ago about how Europe might evolve on this front internally, which I think will be ultimately good both for them and for the rest of the world. But we'll see how it all plays out.
Thank you for also your very detailed explanation. That's a question also from WeChat, and the question is, can you speak to the Federal Reserve's rule in controlling the price of money and the distribute effect on the wealth? Low interest rate over the past decade has discouraged domestic saving. Now, high inflation is stripping away the value of the saved money and eroding purchasing power of the working people.
Well, I think there is a problem with the Fed and with central banks generally. I think they've been too concerned about financial stability and not concerned enough about economic growth. But I'll let Matt jump in, because he focuses on the Fed much more than I do. But I just want to say one thing. The argument that low interest rates have discouraged savings in the US, I don't think is correct at all. I think it's a very standard argument. But there's no evidence that low interest rates discourage savings. In China, for example, in the first decade of this century, interest rates were severely negative. Real interest rates were very negative, and the savings rate exploded. I think you have to be careful not to confuse savings with household savings. Low interest rates might discourage household savings. In some cases, they encourage household savings. It depends on your reason for saving. But what's really important for the savings rate is not whether households save or not. What's really important is the distribution of income within different groups, because we know some groups save a lot, some groups don't, and that's what really matters.
Yeah, I would say actually that, if anything, the causation is the other way around, which is that it's excessive saving that leads to interest rates being low. And that, I generally think, with some exceptions, but in general, central banks, especially central banks like the Fed that are pretty explicit about what they're targeting, they're really setting, they're setting interest rates basically following what, where the sort of the economy is guiding them to be. They're trying to say, okay, we want to have growth be, more or less stable. We want to have inflation be more or less stable. We want to have employment, as high as we think it can be. What is a set of interest rates that's going to lead to that outcome? And that, whatever that set of, leaving aside whether that's, the right way to set economic policy in general or manage the economy, leaving that aside, if that's the way you're going to go about it, then the interest rate you pick is really a function of all sorts of other things that are outside of your control, like who wants, how many people want to borrow, how much do they want to borrow, do they want to borrow, how much people are trying to save, what's the balance of those things. I think the distribution of income actually has a really big impact on this. Something I wrote about actually back in August. There's some economists, Atif Mian, Ludwig Straub, and Amir Sufi, they wrote a paper, and following, I mean, they're very sympathetic to our reading of our book. Their paper came out actually after our book came out, so we weren't able to write about it explicitly, but they make this point that you can draw a link, I think, between the decline in interest rates globally, not just in the US, and the increase in inequality. That the increase in inequality caused the decline in interest rates, because essentially the decline in interest rates was the sort of necessary offsetting force to keep the economy, prevent sort of permanent depression, given the fact that and encourage enough borrowing to offset the fact that you didn't have the income going to people who would otherwise spend it. And so I think that's probably the more helpful way of thinking about this.
Thank you.
May I just add one thing to Matt, because I think something that I would recommend that all of you think about very seriously. I think, Matt and I would both consider ourselves followers of a tradition that includes, people like Martin Wolf. And what I like about Martin is that he's incapable almost of thinking of countries. He has to think globally. And I think we don't do that enough. Very often you will see something happen in the US and you will explain it with US reasons. And this is a big country problem. You see it in China, in Brazil, in India, in Russia, et cetera. And yet you don't notice that thing that's happening in the US is also happening in the rest of the world. So when people say low US interest rates are caused by XYZ in the US, then you're assuming that it's merely coincidence that there are low interest rates in Europe and in China and in Japan, et cetera, et cetera. And it could be coincidence, but it's incredibly unlikely. So it's probably better sometimes to look for global explanations for phenomena that seem to be occurring not just in one country, but across a bunch of countries.
Thank you. So there's a question about how you envision the trade wars will end it. It said a trade war deviated from the theory of comparative disadvantage and will affect the optimal allocation of the resources on global scale. If a class chooses to give up the advantage that may benefit more participants in trade for its own benefit, will the world return to trade cooperation after face conflicts?
Well, as we said earlier, the comparative advantage argument, which is a very limited argument, and one of which conclusions is that in a world of free trade, you maximize total production. As we've argued, that's simply not true. In our world of free trade, you become internationally competitive not by increasing productivity, but by lowering wages. And when you lower wages, you reduce demand. And ultimately, if demand doesn't increase, production doesn't increase. We would argue that certainly I would, I don't want to put words in Matt's mouth, but I would argue that a reversal, at least a partial reversal of the current globalization process, what Danny Roderick, one of my favorite economists, refers to as hyperglobalization, would actually increase global production. The problem is that it isn't solved because of tariffs or anything like that. We need to be much more intelligent. But we have to think about how this game ends. The way the world works right now, the US, because of its open capital markets, is necessarily the consumer of last resort, not because it wants to be, but because as long as it has open capital markets and as long as people prefer to park their excess savings in the US, and roughly half of all the excess savings in the world are parked in the US, and much of the rest is parked in England, Canada, and Australia, all of which have very, very similar financial markets. But as long as that happens, then the US is forced to be the absorber of deficient demand abroad. Now, when the US was 50% of the world, this wouldn't have been a problem. The US today is still very large. It's about 24% of the world. But if you believe that the rest of the world will grow faster than the US, that means the US has to bear a bigger and bigger and bigger burden until eventually we see a collapse. I think long before that, something will happen. And the way I see it, there are two things that can happen, one good and one bad. The good thing is that we reconvene a Bretton Woods type negotiation in which countries get together and replan, redesign the global trade and capital regime along the lines that Keynes said at Bretton Woods. We didn't follow Keynes's model, unfortunately, in my opinion, but that's the basic model we follow, in which basically imbalances can't exist because there will be pressure on surplus countries, which is where the imbalances originate, pressure on surplus countries to resolve their imbalances domestically. So that would be the good way. Then we would have a globalized world under much better trading rules. The more likely way, unfortunately, is that the US eventually decides it refuses to bear the cost of this deficient global demand, and it unilaterally imposes, I would argue, capital controls. Some people would argue trade controls, we'll see, but it unilaterally imposes these controls on trade, where it forces the current account deficit to drop very, very rapidly. Now, that could be done in a very disruptive way, but if it's done in a smooth way, it would benefit the US. But it would be devastating for countries that rely on the US market, because I assume if the US did that, England and Canada and Australia would do it too. It would be devastating for countries that rely on those markets to resolve their domestic demand imbalances. So Matt mentioned Germany. Germans simply do not consume. Europeans do not consume what Germany produces. They're not paid enough. So if Germany can no longer run a trade surplus, what can it do? Quickly, all it can do is cut production very rapidly, which means a surge in unemployment. The same thing with China. What can it do if the world won't accept its surpluses? Well, the only thing it can do quickly is a surge in unemployment, or it can go crazy and spend money on building, bridges on top of bridges on top of bridges as a way of absorbing that domestic demand. But Germany doesn't have a debt problem, but China already does. That's not a very good solution. But to me, it's sort of inevitable. We're moving in that direction. I would prefer a new Bretton Woods. I'm enough of a realist to suspect it's going to be very hard to do that. And so we will probably have unilateral moves by countries like the US and the UK, in which they force an elimination of trade imbalances.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a question maybe not very related, but it's I think it's also a very interesting question. They ask about the trade wars or class wars. Could this logic be extended to other kind of war?
What do you
Do
think,
you have
Matt?
any insight?
Well, insofar as I think many wars do not generally benefit the most people in the countries that are actually fighting each other, then there's definitely an element there. But yeah, I wouldn't want to overuse what our model to areas that we weren't really coming up with originally.
Okay. Understand. There's another question about the documentary American Factory. I'm not sure whether have you seen this film, American Factory?
I know of it, but I've not seen it. No.
Yeah, they think they ask about, do you think this documentary is a good example of class war exceeding cultural conflicts? It talk about a Chinese manufacturer. They have a factory in US and hire a lot of American local people to work there. So basically, it's
Right.
talk
You
about,
know, I think to me the easiest way, you know, the shortcut, the cheap shortcut to becoming, you know, very knowledgeable about economics is to read tons of history. And those of us who are, I think I'm referring only to myself here, those of us who are a little older will remember exactly the same movie coming out about Japan. I mean, it was very, very similar in the 1980s. And these movies were, you know, fairly simple. They tried to explain Japanese and US trade imbalances and the huge surge in Japan as a result of cultural factors. And in retrospect, we now know that the huge surge in Japan in the 1980s was nothing to do with cultural factors. It was just a huge, perhaps the worst bubble of all time. And Japan has spent the last 20, 30 years trying to resolve it. So, you know, I think these things are fun. I think they're important because they affect the political debate. I don't think they're terribly useful. I think, you know, I think it's, you know, I don't want to oversimplify, but I think if you look at, you know, I'm going to sound like a Marxist here, but if you look at the economic substructure, you get most of the rest of it correct. You don't need, you know, you don't need cultural differences between Americans and Chinese to explain what's happening in either country.
okay, thank you. There's a participant called the Tomahawk.
Yeah, my question is, it seems the RMB, the Chinese yuan is becoming more of a reserve currency. And it seemed to me also that the income gap in China will remain serious. So what's your prediction of the future? Yeah, without any like a new Bretton Woods Accord or new or other.
What do you think, Matt? You want to address that?
I guess the question
turn.
is, yeah, I guess the question is how much, you know, yuan actually is becoming a reserve currency to the extent that the other major reserve currencies are. I mean, I think, you know, the big challenge is, are there enough assets available for people outside the country to buy that can be converted at short notice into goods and services that you really want when you really need them? That's really the test. And it's not clear to me that I mean, I think in theory, the euro actually would be more the obvious. If we were thinking of multiple reserve currencies simultaneously with, you know, on par with the dollar, the euro would be the obvious one in terms of it's an economy of a similar size. You have ostensibly the kind of, you know, legal system and so forth that might be, but, you know, it's a very fractured market, and European governments have basically said they don't want to borrow because of the euro crisis. And so that's not an option. China is obviously a very large economy. It's a diversified economy that produces a lot of things. So in theory, you know, that would be valuable, but the Chinese financial system and legal system is not one that is currently anyway set up for, you know, to be receptive to what would be, you know, trillions of dollars worth of financial inflows from the rest of the world. You know, what is it that those investors would buy? And would the Chinese government be comfortable having that much of its, of Chinese financial assets owned by foreigners who might, in a pinch need to sell it. I mean, we saw even, actually, I mean, just in March in 2020 with the US Treasury market, which is ostensibly, the safe, large, super liquid, the thing that, the benchmark reserve asset. And during COVID, basically, you had a situation where everyone who had treasuries, not everyone, enough people who had treasuries, they found they were not quite what they needed for actual cash to meet payments because they were worried about, the pandemic, just losing everything. And they sold en masse. They basically sold to buy things like treasury bills or whatever. So it wasn't as if it was a flight from the dollar, but it was a flight from treasury specifically. The Fed had to step in. It was actually a bit of a crisis. They spent, a year and a half writing research papers on what happened, creating new facilities. Is that the kind of thing that the Chinese government would, feel comfortable, exposing themselves to that kind of potential volatility? Is the kind of thing that, realistically other people would, feel trust that the Chinese government would have their back in that kind of situation? And that's leaving aside the fact that, being open to that volume of financial inflows would then likely lead to the kinds of potential distortions you have in your domestic economy that we've seen in the United States and in the other advanced English-speaking economies, which is the more your financial system is optimized to serve the needs of the world as a whole, which it has to be the case if you're going to be a reserve currency, then that means the less optimized it is for, the people in your country specifically. And that creates all sorts of trade-offs that are unpleasant. I mean, that's why people in the US and elsewhere are thinking maybe that we need to have some kind of a change. Would China want to go in sort of the opposite direction? I mean, there might be benefits to it, but it's not clear to me that that's something that really is being done yet. And I mean, in practice, in terms of the actual foreign ownership share of Chinese assets, it is still quite low and it's still pretty controlled. And I think that's probably because there is a lot of skepticism, not unreasonable skepticism necessarily, within China about whether that's good for them. So I'm not sure, Michael probably has other thoughts on this, but I'm not sure, to what extent, that yuan being a reserve currency, being a reserve currency on a par with the dollar in terms of relative to the Chinese economy size, something that actually is in, the near future at all.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been in China for 20 years, and it's always been the case that within 5 years it'll be a major reserve currency, and it's barely moved. In fact, if you adjust its share of global trade for the size of the economy, what's really shocking about China is not how important it's becoming or the renminbi, but just how incredibly unimportant it is. It's on par with the Canadian dollar or the Mexican peso. And there's a reason for that. The renminbi is never going to become, or at least not for many decades, and not without a very significant political change, which I obviously don't want to discuss. It cannot become a major reserve currency. And the reason is quite simple. If you want to have a major reserve currency, if you want to have one of the really important ones, you need to have a very large economy. Okay, great. China has a large economy. You need to give up control of your capital account. You need to give up control of your current account. You need to be able and willing to run huge current account deficits. And you need to give up control of your financial system. And there's absolutely no evidence that Beijing wants to do any of those things. When you talk to politicians and military people, they say, yes, we want the renminbi to be a major currency because of all the political benefits that brings us. It does bring political benefits, but at huge economic costs. And Beijing has made it very, very clear that they do not want to pay any of those economic costs. And so that's why, even at the PBOC, at the People's Bank of China, when people talk about the renminbi becoming a major reserve currency, you can tell that they're saying it mostly because they're supposed to say it. They don't really believe it. And they don't really believe it because they understand what reserve currency status, what a global trading currency status means. Maybe, the latest data suggests that renminbi represents about 2.7% of international currency trade. Maybe they'll go up to 3.5%. We heard exactly the same talk about the Japanese yen. And I think I think Japan is about 3 or 4% today.
Yeah, the yen's higher. Yeah, the yen and the pound are both significantly higher. The British pound, I mean, that's not a major economy.
Yeah, 40 years later, the yen still has. If you read books in the 1990s talking about the currency regime of the 21st century, I guarantee you they will all say in the 21st century, there will be two, maybe three major currencies, the US dollar, the Japanese yen, and maybe the European currency. Nobody says that anymore. And I think it's because in order to become a major traded currency, you have to give up a lot of things that Japan was unwilling to give up and that China is certainly unwilling to give up.
Thank you. This question from Paul Zhang.
Thank you. And my question is, as I understood that China's problem is that the internal demand is quite weak and there's a large gap between different groups of people. So do you have any solutions for those problems?
The real gap is not between different groups of people. Common prosperity attempts to address that. I think it won't work, but that's not the problem. The problem in China is that whereas in most countries, households retain 65 at the bottom to 80% at the top of GDP, in China, it's 55. And the counterbalance, businesses retain 20 to 25, which is roughly in line with most countries. The real distortion in China is that the government retains about 20 to 25% of GDP. Now, in some Scandinavian countries, you see that too, but government income is redirected through the social welfare system to the household sector. In China, it's not. It's redirected into investment, basically to increase or to maintain savings, not to increase consumption. So we know what the solution is. It's just arithmetic. You've got to transfer money from local governments to the household sector. The problem, as I said earlier, is that's politically incredibly complicated and almost certainly requires significant, let's call it institutional reform. So it's very hard to do. Very few countries have been able to do it. Japan had to rebalance, and we started to see a partial rebalancing in the 1990s, and then it stalled out. And it's not a coincidence that Japan still hasn't grown. They've never been able to rebalance, even though they've been talking about it for years, about raising the consumption share of GDP. It's just been incredibly difficult to do.
Okay, the next question from Chen.
First of all, thank you very much for this. And I want to bring up a different view, if I may. So I found this review from by Michael Roberts, and he argued that according to his review of your book, it is not lack of consumption that is key to the class war. It is actually the result of the declining profitability of capital in the major capitalist economies, forcing companies to look overseas to invest where profitability is higher. And besides, in your analysis, it actually reveals that there has been a rise in consumption as a share of GDP in China in the last 10 years. However, he also puts that you did not know that the investment ratio in emerging economies is up to 10% in the last 10 years. So actually, this might be a little controversial, but I think it's quite interesting to have a little discussion on a different view. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I remember reading that review when it came out. Yeah, I remember reading that review came out. I'm not. I guess one thing I would say is it's important when talking about things like consumption and investment to distinguish between proportions of GDP and absolute levels. Because if you have a situation where overall GDP is flat or growing very weakly, you can have the share of consumption going up or down or what have you, but it doesn't really tell you about, is consumption growth strong relative to the past. And so one of the points we make in the book, which I think was surprising when I first found this out, but I think is important because it's counterintuitive to a lot of what I think a lot of us thought we knew. In the period in the US in like 2000, 2006, you have, people think like, oh, like consumer spending was just off the charts. It was a crazy time. Everyone was borrowing to buy like, 20 new hot tubs or whatever. Actually, that's not true. Consumer spending in the US grew at a relatively weak pace in that period. It wasn't tremendously weak, but it was weak relative to the long-term trend up until that point. And you look at, inflation adjusted consumer spending per person. The reason why the consumption share of GDP grew during that period was because the rest of the economy was even weaker. So basically, one way of looking at it is that households' living standards were growing less than they were before, slower rate. But the reason that debt grew as much as it did is because incomes were growing. The slowdown in income growth was even more severe. So everything slowed down. Everything was weaker in that period, but income growth was even worse. And so that's why the consumption share went up. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't underconsumption. And you can look at this in a lot of other societies as well that had these kind of issues. I mean, every society is different. So I don't want to say, we should all sort of overgeneralize. I mean, we go into detail in the book about what happened in each country, but I think that's an important point. I would also sort of question about, we talk about the declining profitability of capital. I mean, profits have been actually very strong throughout this period, in the past few decades. In fact, they were rising. I think they maybe started to go, profit margins were going down a little bit before COVID, but I mean, they were very, very high compared to, previous periods globally. So I'd sort of be skeptical of that kind of explanation of what's been happening. But that's sort of my, not without, having the full, text in front of me or whatever of the review based on what you said, that those are sort of my initial thoughts.
Thank you. We almost ran out of time. Maybe the last question from Jin Yun. Her question is, thank you for your speech. Do you think will RMB settlement or all the trade in the near future? What's the influence for the world?
That's a very hard question to answer, not because it's hard to figure out what the answer is. I think the answer is it makes almost no difference. It's a hard question to answer because it's very hard to understand the logic of why, if somebody denominates a part of their oil trade in a particular currency, why that's so important. What I always tell people is that if you have an iPhone, you can pretty much denominate trade in any currency you want for any commodity. It doesn't really matter that much. At the end of the day, when you sell oil, the important issue from the point of view of global trade is not what currency you denominate your trade in. It really doesn't matter. You can sell oil in Ecuadorian sucres if you like. The real question is, what do you do with the currency? And that means basically, when you run a surplus, you must recycle that surplus into foreign assets. So the real question is not what's the currency of the trade. The real question is, what are ultimately the foreign assets that you're going to acquire? And nothing there really changes. Most countries, when they acquire foreign assets, they do so directly or indirectly. Roughly half of it is in the US, and of what's left, roughly half is in the other Anglophone economies. And until that changes, nothing else will really change. Denomination itself doesn't really matter. Okay.
Well, there's come another question. Is they ask about what's your opinion about industry transfer can stop trade war or make difference?
I'm not sure I understand that. Matt, do you understand it?
I can think of a couple different interpretations of that question, so I'm not sure which one. I mean, like industries moving from one country to another, or are you talking about technology transfers, or?
Let me answer what I think the question is. Maybe this is referring to offshoring industry, moving industries around. There isn't a problem with moving a business to a country that has a comparative advantage in that business. So for example, if an American manufacturer moves her factory to Vietnam, because there is something about Vietnam that is more efficient in the production of that good, that's not a problem. In a well-functioning world, she will move her factory to Vietnam. She will pay her workers. She will pay her workers something in line with their productivity. those workers will receive income and they must spend that income. And that they will spend it on either on imports or on domestic consumption. If they spend it on domestic consumption, the recipients will then spend it on imports or domestic consumption. And as you go around, you'll see that ultimately they will import as much as they are now able to export because of the transfer of the factory. So when you look at it from, assume there are two countries, the US and Vietnam, and the US manufacturer used to make things to sell to Americans and then decides it's better in Vietnam, moves the factory to Vietnam. What really happens? If the Vietnamese workers are paid relative to their productivity, then all that will happen is that Vietnam will export stuff to the US and will import just as much. So American workers at the factory will lose their jobs, but American workers that produce the stuff that Vietnam imports will have more jobs. And the net result will be that American productivity goes up and Vietnamese productivity goes up. That's good trade. If, however, and this is much more likely, she moves her factory to Vietnam, not because of comparative advantage, but just because Vietnamese wages are so low, then what's happening is that the Vietnamese will never be able to import as much as they export. So they will reduce global demand, and the American workers who lost their job won't be balanced by other American workers who gain jobs because of higher American exports. So in our book, we don't argue that offshoring is a bad thing. We don't argue that, that moving businesses around to where they're more efficient is a bad thing. What we argue is that if the only reason you move production is to take advantage of a bigger gap between wages and productivity, then you're hurting the global economy. But if there isn't the gap, then it's not a problem at all. That's how trade works. That's how everyone gets richer in a well-functioning global trade environment.
Yeah, I would also just add, just to follow on that, there's nothing wrong. It would be good for the world if every country is rich enough and technologically sophisticated enough to make their own airplanes and microchips and everything else. It's not the idea that you have to hoard those industries for yourself, and that's the secret to prosperity is wrong. The reason why it would potentially be a problem is if those industries move and then the people, instead of saying, oh, we're richer now because we make these things, we can import more stuff, or we don't need to export as much stuff, or whatever. Otherwise, they have the same kind of existing trade imbalance problem, because then it becomes an issue. But that, as Michael was saying, there's nothing wrong with trade. I mean, we are in favor of trade. I think, trade is, there's all sorts of reasons why it makes sense to have, people making things all over the world. The problem is if trade is basically a means of getting around either environmental regulations or human rights, rules or labor protections, and basically kind of forcing your way down, and having, a way for business elites to basically squeeze workers at the expense of, global workers everywhere. And that's really when it becomes a problem.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, both of you, for your very insightful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As the last thing is we have a tradition to take a group photo, and now I also will unmute all of the participants to say a thank you to both of you, and also please turn on your camera. We want to take a photo with both.
Unfortunately, I have class, so I'm going to bag out. But thank you very much for this, and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Mr. Matthew Klein. Very late with us. Thank you.
Yeah.